The aim of the Zionists to dispossess Palestinians of their land was clear to the Palestinian population. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, there has been numerous uprisings against British colonialism and Zionist settlements, the most famous of which was the 1936-1939 revolt. In 1936, the Palestinians launched a general strike that lasted 6 months, the longest general strike in history. The strike was followed by a guerrilla war that lasted nearly 3.5 years. It was not until September 1939, the same month that the World War II began in Europe, that the British finally succeeded in crushing the rebellion by brute force. The Palestinian fighters were let down by the lack of a revolutionary party to lead the struggle. Despite this critical problem and a lack of sufficient arms and equipment, they carried on an intense struggle against the world's most powerful empire. During the revolt, the British occupiers imposed repressive laws called emergency regulations on the Arab population. Many of the regulations are still used today by the Israelis against Palestinians in the West Bank. These emergency measures legalized a number of actions such as including detention, imprisonment without charge, and house demolition. The revolutionary writer and leader Hassan Kanafani, who was assassinated by the Israeli Secret Service in 1972, elaborated on this point. Kanafani says that according to a British estimate submitted to the League of Nations, the number of Palestinian Arabs killed in the revolt was around 1,000, as well as many who were wounded and missing. Many houses were destroyed and more than 6,000 people became homeless. In the course of the struggle, the British had aided and were aided by the armed police of the Jewish agency. The puppet monarch in Jordan, King Abdullah, was also helping the British. One of the tactics of the Palestinian resistance was to blow up the oil pipeline that the British built from Kirkuk in Iraq to Haifa in Palestine. After a number of these attacks, the British assigned the Zionist police to guard the pipeline inside Palestine, and Abdullah's force were assigned to do the similar task in Jordan. The Palestinian defeat in the 1936-39 uprising had a profound effect on the future shape of the conflict. When World War II broke out in Europe in 1939, the Zionist forces were greatly strengthened while the Palestinians were weak and decimated. Both the justice in the Palestinian resistance and the colonial nature of Zionism had been openly admitted by none other than the central Zionist leader Ben-Gurion. He openly states about the Palestinians, saying that a people that is being usurped of their land won't give up easily. Ben-Gurion also said that politically they are the aggressors and the Palestinians are only defending themselves. In the midst of the Palestinian revolt in 1937, the British Peel Commission recommended the partition of Palestine and the creation of a small Jewish state. Many Zionist leaders opposed the proposal because it did not meet their goals. Ben-Gurion argued for accepting it, though only as a short-term solution. He viewed the proposal as merely a first step towards taking over all of Palestine in the name of Zionism. Just years later, the Zionists would implement the most bloody means in an attempt to realize their goals. In 1939, the Nazi armies invaded Poland, signaling the start of World War II in Europe. By mid-1941, Germany, Italy, and their fascist allies occupied nearly all of the continental Europe west of the Soviet Union. On June 22nd of that year, they launched an all-out attack on the USSR. David Ben-Gurion, who was to become Israel's first prime minister, wrote in 1939 that while World War I had brought the Balfour Declaration, the Second World War would result in the creation of a Zionist state. Suffused with anti-Semitism themselves, many in the US ruling class in the 1930s viewed Nazi Germany as a weapon against their main enemy of the time, Soviet Union. In November 1938, the Kristallnacht, or translated as the Night of the Broken Glass, happens. This Nazi pogrom killed more than 1,300 Jewish people in Germany and destroyed 7,000 businesses in one night. 1 month after the Kristallnacht pogrom, Ben-Gurion expressed his view on the relationship between what was happening in Germany and the Zionist project in Palestine. He bluntly said that he would rather have a separate state for the Jews, even if it meant not being able to save half of the Jewish population. His words exposes the cold pragmatism of Zionism. To the Zionist leaders, it was preferable to have an exclusivist state controlled by them rather than to benefit the Jewish people. The imperialist compassion was no better. Even after entering the war and being informed of the mass murder underway in the fascist concentration camps, there was no sign of concern from the ruling circles in Washington and London. US Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr. was the only Jewish member of the President Roosevelt's cabinet. On January 13, 1944, he issued a report that was highly unusual for someone in his position. In it, Morgenthau protested how his own government was failing to respond to the Nazi genocide which is happening in full swing. The US imperialists took no remedial steps. During the Nazi genocide, 6 million Jews were murdered. Millions of Roma and Slavic people, lesbians, gays, disabled people, communists, and anyone who resisted fascism were also killed. It would not have been difficult for the United States to absorb or take in 400,000 Jewish refugees, particularly since the US mainland had suffered no damage during the World War and its economy was booming. But US corporate and government leaders opposed opening the doors to the survivors of Nazi persecution, fearing that they may be influenced by communist and socialist ideas. The Zionist leaders were also aware of the desire of the European Jewish survivors to come to the United States. They were also equally opposed to the notion because it threatened the realization of their core goal. As the Zionist Rabbi Abraham Klausner said, Jews should be forced to go to the Palestine. To build a Jewish camp, the Zionists needed to get as many refugees as possible to Palestine. Although the US government had done little before or during the World War II to aid the Jewish victims of fascism, it quickly used the very real horrors of Hitler's death camps to rally public opinion in favor of establishing the State of Israel. Once the war was over, the gathering momentum behind the plans to create Israel became seemingly unstoppable.